Ka Inoi Ho Kon Dong Gay SOC. Poor people shouldn't lecture anyone about family money, my niece Olivia said with a bright laugh as she lifted her wine glass and looked directly at me across the dinner table, and the rest of the room followed her gaze like they had been waiting for that moment all evening. I remember the way the chandelier light reflected off the polished oak table, the way forks paused halfway to mouths, the way several relatives smiled politely before quickly looking down at their plates, as if pretending the moment wasn't happening. It was my son Daniel's house, a large suburban place outside Boston with a backyard big enough to fit half the neighborhood for summer barbecues. And that night the dining room was filled with the usual Whitmore family noise. Glasses clinking, quiet laughter, the smell of rosemary chicken drifting through the air. I had arrived carrying a simple blueberry pie from the grocery store down the street from my apartment, wearing the same navy cardigan I'd owned for nearly 10 years, and driving the same 2008 Buick I'd driven since my husband passed away. To Olivia, those things were evidence of something embarrassing. To me, they were simply life. She leaned back in her chair, brushing a strand of blonde hair over her shoulder as if she were the host of the evening instead of the guest of honor, because tonight was supposed to celebrate her promotion at a marketing firm downtown. I mean really, she continued with a small shrug, Aunt Margaret still shops at thrift stores. I guess some people just get comfortable living small. A few cousins chuckled softly. Someone cleared their throat. My daughter-in-law Caroline forced a tight smile and took a sip of wine. Daniel stared at his plate, pushing a piece of chicken around with his fork as though the pattern of sauce mattered more than the words that had just been said. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I folded my hands around my teacup and looked at Olivia the same way I had looked at her since she was a child running through my late husband's garden, loud and bright, and certain the world belonged to her. The truth is, people often mistake quiet for weakness. Olivia certainly did. For years she had watched me arrive at family gatherings in that same old car, carrying homemade desserts or modest gifts, speaking gently, and leaving early. In her mind, I was the relative who had fallen behind, the widow who had never quite recovered financially after my husband Robert died. She had no idea how carefully I listened to the conversations that floated through rooms like this one. She had no idea how often the word inheritance appeared in those conversations, or how often the words trust fund did. Olivia lifted her glass again, smiling toward the rest of the table as if she had just delivered a perfectly harmless joke. Relax, she said lightly, glancing back at me. I'm just saying the younger generation has bigger plans. More laughter. I noticed the way my cousin Greg nodded slightly, the way my sister Ruth avoided my eyes, the way Olivia's confidence grew with every second no one challenged her. It's strange how people reveal themselves when they think money belongs to them. I took a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest, and the room gradually returned to its comfortable hum of conversation. Plates shifted. Someone asked Daniel about the Red Sox season. Olivia reached for the breadbasket, still smiling to herself like someone who had just won a small, easy victory. That was the exact moment her phone buzzed against the table. The sound was sharp enough that several people looked over. Olivia glanced down casually at first, but the expression on her face changed almost instantly. Her smile disappeared. Her eyes widened. She picked up the phone and stared at the screen as if it had suddenly started speaking a different language. That's strange, she murmured, tapping the display once, then twice. A quiet ripple of curiosity moved through the table. Is everything okay? Caroline asked. Olivia didn't answer immediately. She kept staring at the phone, her fingers frozen above the glass surface. The room felt different now, quieter somehow, as if the air itself had paused. Finally she looked up, confusion and something close to panic flickering across her face. Why would my trust account be frozen? She asked aloud. No one responded right away. Not Daniel. Not Caroline. Not the cousins who had laughed just minutes earlier. I set my teacup gently on the table and met Olivia's eyes across the room. For the first time that evening, she wasn't smiling. For several seconds no one at the table moved. Olivia kept staring at her phone as if the screen might correct itself if she waited long enough. I could hear the faint ticking of the kitchen clock down the hallway and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Small sounds that normally disappeared under conversation suddenly felt very loud. Daniel finally cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward his daughter. What do you mean frozen? He asked, trying to sound calm, though I noticed the way his fingers tightened around his fork. Olivia turned the phone toward him, her voice thin with disbelief. My trust account. It says access temporarily suspended pending trustee review. She blinked twice, as though reading the words again might change them. That does not make any sense. Caroline leaned forward from across the table. Maybe it is a bank error, she suggested quickly. Those things happen sometimes. Olivia shook her head. No, this is not a bank error. This is from the trust administrator. Her eyes moved slowly around the table, searching for someone who could explain it. I kept my hands folded on the tablecloth, the same way I had been sitting for most of the evening. Years of quiet dinners had taught me something important about family conversations. The loudest people often understand the least. Olivia tapped the screen again, scrolling through the message. Her breathing had become shallow, the confident energy she carried earlier now replaced by confusion. It says trustee authorization required for further distribution, she read out loud. What trustee? My cousin Greg frowned. I thought the trust paid out automatically once everyone reached a certain age. Olivia nodded quickly. Exactly. That is how it has always worked. She turned toward her father. Dad, you know that. Grandpa set it up so that each of us would have access once we turned 25. Daniel shifted in his chair. That is what I remember. His voice sounded less certain now. I watched Olivia carefully. For most of her life, she had spoken about that trust fund with the easy confidence of someone who believed the money already belonged to her. Vacations, business investments, even the condo she talked about buying someday near the coast. In her mind, the future had already been purchased. She looked down again at the phone and shook her head. This has to be a mistake. Caroline tried to lighten the mood with a small laugh. Well, if it is frozen, I am sure it will be fixed tomorrow. It is Friday night. Banks close early. Olivia did not laugh. She stood slightly from her chair, still staring at the message. No, this specifically says trustee review. Her eyes narrowed as she looked around the table again. Who even is the trustee? No one answered immediately. It was interesting to watch the silence stretch across the room like a shadow. Some people looked toward Daniel. Others looked down at their plates. A few glanced briefly toward me, then away again. I could almost see the memories moving through their heads, small half-forgotten details about my husband Robert, the legal meetings that happened years ago after his health began to decline, the quiet paperwork that followed after his funeral. Olivia finally spoke again, her voice sharper now. Dad, you handled Grandpa's estate stuff after he passed away. So who is the trustee? Daniel hesitated. He rubbed his forehead slowly, as if searching through files in his memory that had not been opened in years. I remember the trust being established, he said carefully. But the management part was handled by the attorney and the trustee. Olivia's impatience was returning, though it was mixed now with something uneasy. Then call the attorney, she said. This needs to be fixed immediately. I lifted my teacup again and took another small sip. The tea had cooled slightly, but it was still warm enough to be comforting. Across the table, Olivia was already unlocking her phone again, preparing to make a call. For the first time that evening, she was not looking at me with amusement or superiority. She was looking at the problem, and she still had no idea where it had come from. Olivia stood up from her chair so quickly that it brushed against the hardwood floor with a soft scrape. She stepped away from the table, holding the phone tightly in one hand as though the message might disappear if she loosened her grip. Everyone watched her pace 2 slow steps toward the kitchen island before stopping again. The confidence she had carried earlier in the evening had faded into something restless and uncertain. This does not make any sense, she repeated, more quietly this time. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, looking toward the hallway where Olivia had paused. Call the trust administrator, he said. They will explain it. Olivia nodded quickly, already scrolling through her contacts. The room remained silent except for the faint tapping of her fingers on the screen. A moment later, she raised the phone to her ear. Hello, this is Olivia Whitmore, she said, forcing a steady tone. I just received a notification saying my trust account access has been suspended. She paused, listening. Her posture straightened slightly, as though she expected the explanation to arrive within seconds. Across the table, Caroline adjusted the napkin on her lap and tried to resume eating, though the rhythm of the evening had already broken. My cousin Greg stared at his glass of water. Ruth quietly reached for the breadbasket, but did not take anything from it. Everyone was listening to Olivia without appearing to listen. I rested my hands around the warm ceramic of my teacup and watched the scene unfold the way someone might watch the final minutes of a play they already understood. Olivia spoke again into the phone, her voice slightly sharper now. Yes, I understand that it says trustee authorization. That is exactly what I am asking about. Why would a trustee suddenly freeze the account? She listened for several seconds. Then her eyebrows drew together in confusion. Yes, I am aware of the Whitmore Family Trust. That is the one I am referring to. Another pause followed. I noticed the subtle shift in her posture again, the way her shoulders stiffened as she listened. What do you mean the trustee requested a review tonight? She asked. Her voice dropped lower, but the quiet dining room carried every word clearly. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Caroline set down her fork. Even Greg looked up now. Olivia turned slowly toward the table while still holding the phone against her ear. Her expression had changed completely. Earlier she had looked amused, then confused. Now she looked unsettled. No, there must be some misunderstanding, she said to the person on the other end. I was not notified of any review. She listened again, longer this time. I watched the color fade slightly from her cheeks as the conversation continued. The person on the phone was speaking calmly. That much was obvious from the rhythm of Olivia's responses. Calm explanations have a way of making people feel even more uneasy when they expect reassurance instead. Yes, she said slowly. I understand that the trustee has full authority. She swallowed once before continuing. But why tonight? Another pause followed. I could almost feel the attention of everyone at the table shifting, like a group of people leaning forward in their seats at the same time. Olivia lowered the phone slightly from her ear, staring down at the floor as if trying to process something she had just heard. Then she raised it again. So you are saying the trustee personally requested the freeze within the last 15 minutes. She spoke the sentence carefully, repeating the information as though confirming it might somehow change the outcome. Silence answered her again. Finally, she ended the call. For several seconds, she simply stood there holding the phone in her hand. No one spoke. Daniel broke the silence first. Well, he asked. Olivia looked back toward the table slowly. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. They said the trustee ordered the freeze tonight, she said. Greg frowned. Who is the trustee again? Olivia did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the table, stopping briefly on each person before finally resting on me. The room seemed to grow very still. They would not say over the phone, she replied softly. I lifted my teacup again and took another calm sip. The silence after Olivia's last sentence stretched across the dining room like a long shadow. No one reached for their fork. No one asked another question. Even the soft music playing somewhere in the living room suddenly felt distant. Olivia was still standing near the kitchen island, holding her phone loosely in her hand as though it had become heavier than she expected. Her eyes had settled on me, but there was no accusation in them yet. Only confusion. Daniel followed her gaze, and then slowly turned toward me as well. Mom, he said carefully. Do you know anything about this? The question floated across the table in a cautious tone, the kind people use when they are unsure whether they want the answer. I did not respond right away. Instead, I placed my teacup back on the saucer and straightened the edge of the napkin beside my plate. Small movements have a way of slowing a room down. When people expect an immediate reaction, silence can feel louder than any explanation. Across the table, Olivia shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The administrator said the trustee personally requested the freeze tonight, she said again, as though repeating the sentence might force it to make sense. Within the last 15 minutes. Greg let out a quiet breath. That is oddly specific timing. Caroline glanced between Daniel and Olivia, her expression tight. Maybe the trustee just noticed something unusual in the account, she suggested, though the words sounded more like hope than belief. Olivia shook her head. No, the trust has been running the same way for years. Nothing suddenly changes without a reason. Her voice had lost the confident edge it carried earlier in the evening. Now it carried something closer to uncertainty. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Who set up the trust again? He asked slowly. Greg answered first. Your father did. Years ago. The memory hung in the air for a moment. Robert Whitmore had always been a careful man when it came to planning the future. Even in his final years, he had spoken often about making sure the family would be secure long after he was gone. Olivia turned back toward Daniel. If Grandpa set it up, Then you must know who the trustee is. Daniel hesitated. He rubbed his temple slowly, the same way he did when he was thinking through something complicated. I remember meeting with the attorney after the funeral, he said. But most of the details were handled through the estate office. Olivia stepped closer to the table now, her eyes moving between each face again before stopping on me once more. This time the confusion in her expression had sharpened slightly into suspicion. The administrator said the trustee requested to freeze tonight, she repeated. Which means whoever it is had to know exactly what was happening at this moment. Caroline looked toward me briefly, then away again. Greg did the same. The pattern repeated quietly around the table. It was subtle, but impossible to miss. Olivia noticed it too. Why is everyone suddenly looking at Aunt Margaret? She asked, her voice tightening slightly. No one answered her question directly. Instead, the room filled with the quiet sound of chairs shifting and glasses being moved across the table. I folded my hands together again and met Olivia's gaze calmly. Years earlier, when Robert first brought the trust documents home, he had placed the folder on our kitchen table and looked at me with the same thoughtful expression he used whenever he was about to say something important. He had believed that families needed structure as much as they needed love. Structure protected people from their worst instincts. Olivia took another step toward the table. Wait, she said slowly, her eyes narrowing as a thought finally began to form. That cannot be right. Her voice was softer now, but it carried clearly across the room. Daniel looked at her. What cannot be right? Olivia glanced at me again, then back at her father. The trustee, she said. The room grew quiet once more as the realization began to move through her mind piece by piece. Olivia stared at me as though she had just noticed something that had been sitting in the room the entire evening without explanation. The realization did not arrive all at once. It moved slowly across her face in small changes, first confusion, then calculation, then something closer to disbelief. No, she said quietly, shaking her head once. That does not make sense. Daniel leaned forward again. What does not make sense? He asked. Olivia did not answer him immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on me. Grandpa would not have done that, she said finally, though her voice sounded less certain than the words suggested. I watched her carefully. When people begin to reconsider assumptions they have carried for years, the moment is almost visible. It is like watching a door open inside their mind that they never realized was there. Greg shifted in his chair. Done what? He asked. Olivia inhaled slowly. He would not have made Aunt Margaret the trustee. The sentence hung in the air for several seconds. No one spoke right away. Daniel blinked once and looked toward me, then back at Olivia. Why not? He asked. Olivia let out a short laugh that sounded forced. Because that would mean she controls the entire trust. The words were meant to sound absurd, but the room did not react the way she expected. Instead, the silence deepened again. Caroline's eyes moved carefully between Daniel and me. Greg leaned back slightly in his chair, as though giving the moment more space to unfold. Olivia noticed the lack of reaction almost immediately. Her confidence slipped another inch. Right? She said, looking toward Daniel. You would know that. Daniel rubbed his forehead again. Slower this time. I remember the lawyer explaining that the trustee had full authority over distributions, he said carefully. Olivia frowned. Yes, but you never said who the trustee was. Daniel hesitated. His gaze drifted toward me for a brief moment before returning to the table. At the time it did not seem important, he admitted quietly. Olivia looked back at me again. The certainty she had carried earlier in the evening had disappeared completely now. Aunt Margaret, she said slowly. You would have mentioned something like that if it were true. I remained seated exactly as I had been for most of the night. Calm posture, hands folded, teacup resting quietly beside my plate. The same calm presence Olivia had mistaken for weakness only half an hour earlier. Your grandfather believed in careful planning, I said gently. Olivia's eyebrows tightened. That is not an answer. Greg cleared his throat softly. Actually, it might be. Olivia turned toward him sharply. What does that mean? Greg shrugged slightly. Robert was very particular about financial decisions. If he believed someone needed oversight, he would have arranged it. Olivia shook her head again, but the movement looked smaller now, less certain. Oversight for what? Greg did not answer her question directly. Instead, he looked toward me with a quiet expression that suggested he had begun connecting the same pieces Olivia was only starting to see. Caroline folded her hands together on the table. Olivia, she said gently, maybe you should ask the administrator who the trustee is. Olivia glanced down at her phone again. The earlier message was still glowing faintly on the screen. Trustee authorization required. The phrase carried more weight now than it had a few minutes earlier. She swallowed once before speaking again. They already told me the trustee personally ordered the freeze tonight, she said. Her voice had become very quiet. Then she looked up at me again, and this time the question in her eyes had finally found its shape. Olivia did not speak for several seconds after that realization appeared in her eyes. She simply stood there beside the kitchen island, holding her phone as if it were the only solid object left in the room. The earlier confidence that had filled her voice during dinner had completely disappeared now, replaced by a careful silence that spread across the table. I watched her closely. People often believe money reveals power. In truth, money reveals character. Daniel shifted in his chair and glanced between us. Olivia, he said quietly, what exactly are you thinking right now? She did not answer him. Her attention remained fixed on me. Slowly, she took a few steps back toward the dining table, as though closing the distance might somehow make the situation clearer. The administrator said the trustee personally requested the freeze, she repeated. Her voice sounded measured now, cautious in a way it had not been earlier, and the timing was within the last 15 minutes. Greg nodded slightly. That is what you said. Olivia swallowed once and placed her phone on the edge of the table. Which means whoever the trustee is, they knew something happened tonight. No one interrupted her reasoning. The room had grown so quiet that the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway sounded almost deliberate. Olivia's eyes moved slowly across the table again before settling on me once more. Grandpa always believed money should come with responsibility, she said carefully. I nodded once. Yes, he did. She hesitated. And he believed someone had to oversee that responsibility. I said nothing. Silence has a way of inviting people to continue thinking out loud. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Olivia, what are you trying to say? She took a breath before answering. I am saying the trustee must have decided tonight that someone at this table made a decision that concerned them. Her words were cautious, but the meaning behind them was growing clearer with every sentence. Caroline lowered her gaze toward the tablecloth. Greg leaned back in his chair again, watching Olivia with a thoughtful expression. Olivia looked directly at me now. You stepped away from the table earlier, she said slowly. Right after dinner started. Daniel frowned. Mom went to the hallway for a few minutes. Olivia nodded. Exactly. The room remained still. I reached for my teacup again and lifted it slowly, taking a small sip before setting it back down on the saucer. My movements were calm, deliberate, unchanged from the beginning of the evening. Olivia watched every motion. You made a phone call, she said. Her voice had dropped almost to a whisper now, but every word carried across the room. Daniel turned toward me again. Mom, he asked quietly. I met his gaze first, then Olivia's. The tension in the room was no longer confusion. It had become understanding waiting for confirmation. Your grandfather asked me to oversee the trust, I said gently. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. Daniel sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly as though a memory had just resurfaced. Greg nodded once, almost to himself. Olivia stared at me, the last pieces of the puzzle sliding into place behind her eyes. You are the trustee, she said. It was not a question. I folded my hands together on the table again and gave a small nod. Yes, I replied calmly. The room fell completely silent. For a long moment Olivia did not move. Her eyes stayed locked on mine as if she were waiting for me to take the words back, to laugh and explain that this had all been a misunderstanding. But I did not laugh. I simply sat there with my hands folded calmly on the table, the same quiet posture I had carried all evening. Across the room Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely louder than the ticking clock in the hallway. I remember now, he said after a few seconds, his voice thoughtful. Dad mentioned something about that before he passed. He said the trust needed someone patient to manage it. Olivia looked at him quickly. You never told me that. Daniel shook his head slightly. At the time it did not seem important. The trust was stable. No one questioned it. Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. Robert always believed money should be protected from impulsive decisions, he said. He said that more than once. Olivia turned back toward me, her expression no longer confused but unsettled. You froze the account, she said quietly. Again, it was not really a question. I nodded once. Yes. Caroline shifted in her chair and looked toward me with careful curiosity. Margaret, she said gently, why would you do that tonight? The answer was simple, though it had been years in the making. I looked around the table slowly, meeting each pair of eyes before speaking again. Because the trust was created to support the family, I said calmly, not to reward disrespect. Olivia let out a soft breath and crossed her arms, though the gesture lacked the confidence it once carried. I made a joke, she said defensively. People tease each other at family dinners all the time. Greg raised an eyebrow, slightly but said nothing. Daniel watched Olivia with a more serious expression now. It was not just a joke, he said quietly. Olivia turned toward him, frustration creeping into her voice. You are taking this too seriously. Daniel did not respond right away. Instead, he glanced toward me again. Mom has always lived simply, he said after a moment. That does not mean she deserves to be mocked for it. The room fell silent again. I lifted my teacup and took another slow sip before speaking. Your grandfather understood something very important, I said. Wealth has a way of changing how people treat others. Olivia shook her head slightly. I was not trying to change anything. Perhaps not intentionally, I replied gently. But character is revealed in small moments. Olivia looked down at the table for a second, then back at me. Freezing the account seems like an extreme reaction, she said. It is temporary, I answered. The trust documents allow the trustee to review any distribution if a beneficiary demonstrates behavior that raises concern. Caroline looked surprised. That is actually written into the trust? She asked. Greg nodded slowly. Robert was very thorough with legal language. Olivia stared at me again, the frustration in her voice fading into something more uncertain. So what happens now? She asked quietly. I rested my hands together once more and met her gaze steadily. Now, I said, we take some time to consider whether the trust is being respected in the way your grandfather intended. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier tension. This silence carried the weight of realization. Olivia looked down at her phone again, the frozen account notification still glowing faintly on the screen, and for the first time that evening, she seemed to understand that the evening had changed something far larger than a simple joke.